this be real? Did I make a mistake by coming out at this hour? What have I gotten myself into? Oh my goodness. Save me from this hour, Jason Harper said to himself. The road stretched for miles, a thin strip of asphalt cutting through the vast emptiness of West Texas. No streetlights, no houses, just the occasional rusted road sign and the endless sea of dry, brittle grass. Jason Harper had been driving for hours, his headlights carving two pale beams through the darkness. He wasn't supposed to be out here this late. The plan was to reach his uncle's place in Pecos before sundown, but a late departure and a wrong turn had thrown everything off. Now, his GPS had lost signal, and the only guide he had was the occasional reflective sign pointing toward a town he had never heard of. He had no memory of seeing Dry Creek on a map, but at this point, stopping anywhere was better than pulling over in the middle of nowhere. The gas gauge was dipping lower than he liked, and his eyelids were starting to feel heavy. As he drove, the darkness outside his car felt thick, too thick. He tried not to focus on it, but something about it unsettled him. His headlights barely seemed to penetrate it, as if the night itself was pressing inward, swallowing the light before it could stretch too far. Then his radio cut out. The soft hum of static filled the car, and Jason frowned, reaching for the dial. He twisted it, searching for a station. Nothing. Every channel was the same, an empty whisper of white noise. A few seconds later, his headlights flickered. Jason tensed. The road in front of him wavered as his high beams briefly dimmed before snapping back to full brightness. He gripped the wheel tighter. Not now, he muttered. He couldn't afford car trouble out here. A mile later, the dashboard lights dimmed. Then the headlights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed him whole. Jason's heart pounded as he slammed the brakes, the tires skidding on the pavement. His foot hovered over the gas, hesitating. His hands were tight on the wheel, fingers clammy. He flicked the headlight switch, nothing. He tapped the dashboard, still dark. The engine was running, but the car's electrical system had completely failed. For a few seconds, he sat there, eyes adjusting to the black void around him. There was no moon, no stars. Only the faint outline of the road barely visible under the weak glow of his phone screen. Then, in the distance, a light blinked. Jason's breath caught. It was a small light like a flashlight beam, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. It flickered once, then again, shifting slightly as if whoever held it was moving. A wave of relief washed over him. Maybe someone else had car trouble. Maybe it was a house or a ranch with a night worker. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal, just a blank screen where the bars should have been. Something about that single, flickering light unnerved him. But sitting in the dark wasn't an option. He had to move. Leaving the car running, Jason grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The air was eerily still. No wind, no insects, just silence. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked forward, keeping his flashlight low. The other light blinked again, a little farther than before. Jason frowned. It almost looked like it had moved away. A slow chill crept up his spine. He kept walking. One step, another. His boots scraped against the road, his breathing loud in the silence. He flicked his light across the dry grass at the roadside, half expecting to see an animal's glowing eyes. Instead, he saw nothing. Then he heard it. A faint footstep, not his, came from behind him. Jason's breath hitched. He froze, listening. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin. He swallowed, his throat dry. Silence. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe it was the echo of his own steps. Then another footstep. Slow, deliberate. This time, it came from the side of the road. His grip on the flashlight tightened. He swung the beam toward the sound. Nothing but open land. But his gut twisted. Something felt wrong. The flickering light ahead blinked again. Closer now. Jason turned back toward his car. He froze. His shadow was on the pavement, but his flashlight wasn't casting it. Jason's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. His shadow stretched long across the road, but it wasn't reacting to his movements. His breath came fast and uneven. He took a step back. The shadow didn't. His pulse slammed against his ribs. He lifted his arm. The shadow stayed still. Then, slowly, it turned its head. Jason ran. His boots pounded against the pavement as he bolted for his car, lungs burning. He fumbled with the door handle, yanking it open just as the temperature dropped. A biting cold that shouldn't exist on a warm Texas night. The moment he slammed the door shut, his headlights turned back on. Jason gasped, staring out through the windshield. The road was empty. His shadow was normal again. The flickering light in the distance was gone. For a long moment, he sat there, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't explain what had just happened. His rational mind screamed that it was a trick of the light, exhaustion, paranoia. But deep down, a single thought clawed at him. Something had been there, and it had seen him. Jason took a shaky breath and put the car in drive. He wasn't stopping again. Whatever was out there, he wasn't waiting for it to come back. The next sign came into view. As he passed it, his radio crackled to life. Jason jumped, his eyes flicking to the digital screen. The station dial wasn't showing a number, just a single word, glitching in and out. Run. Jason's hands gripped the wheel tight as he passed the last sign for Dry Creek. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to this tiny town. Maybe it was the fuel gauge flirting with empty, or the eerie feeling still clinging to the back of his mind. But he needed to stop, needed to refuel and gather himself. The town was just as small as the signs had promised. One main street, with a few weathered buildings that looked like they hadn't seen paint in decades. Jason drove past a rundown diner, a gas station with a flickering neon sign, and a few houses that seemed to be nothing more than structures waiting to collapse. There was an air of quiet tension as he drove through. No bustling crowd, no kids running around or playing in the yards. Not even a car on the street except his own. It was like the town had been frozen in time, waiting for something to happen. He pulled up to the gas station and cut the engine. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the heavy scent of old oil and burnt coffee filling the air. A tall man behind the counter, his weathered face lined with years of hard work, glanced up as Jason walked in. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was low, almost reluctant. "I need to fill up," Jason said, nodding toward his car. The man gave a curt nod and turned to the pump. Jason's eyes scanned the station, noting how the shelves were stocked with old newspapers, forgotten magazines, and dusty cans of food. The place felt more like a time capsule than a functioning gas station. Just as Jason stepped back outside, he saw the first person in town. A woman walking toward him from the opposite end of the street, her gait slow and deliberate, as if she was carefully measuring each step. Her face was hard to make out under the wide brim of her hat, but her eyes glowed with an unnatural sharpness. She walked past Jason, not even sparing him a glance, but he felt the weight of her stare. The woman's presence lingered in the air like an electric charge. It was impossible to shake. Jason stood there for a few moments, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, trying to shake off the chill running down his spine. When he turned back to the gas station, the man was watching him now, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything all right?" Jason asked, trying to brush off the growing sense of unease. The man's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, just turned his back to Jason and continued refilling the pump. Jason didn't press the issue, but as he waited, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He hadn't come this far to get caught up in strange looks from the locals, but there was something about Dry Creek that felt off, wrong. As Jason filled his tank, he glanced around for some sign of a local diner, maybe a place to sit and gather his thoughts. His mind was still racing from his encounter with the strange flickering lights earlier. He needed food and some kind of break before heading out again. A low hum cut through the air, the sound of a car approaching from the distance. Jason glanced over, spotting a dusty old sedan cruising toward the main street. The vehicle slowed as it neared him, but then, without even stopping, it turned down an alley that wasn't even visible from the road. Jason blinked. That was strange. He finished up and made his way down the street, heading toward a small building marked with a faded, Dry Creek Diner sign hanging above the door. The lights inside were dim, and as he opened the door, A sudden wave of heat enveloped him. The air smelled like stale coffee and burnt toast. A man behind the counter, his face grizzled with a heavy stubble, glanced up from the grill. "What can I get you?" Jason nodded. "Coffee. Black." The man gave him a thin smile. Coming right up, Jason sat down at the counter, trying to push aside the gnawing feeling of dread that had begun to settle in his gut. He had to shake it off, he had to focus. This was just a town like any other, right? It wasn't like something out of a horror movie. Then something caught his eye, a photo on the wall. It was a black and white picture, so old the edges were yellowed with time. A group of people in what looked like a church or community hall. But something about the people in the photo unsettled him. There was something wrong about their eyes. Each person in the photo had their eyes closed. They were smiling, but their eyes were shut. And Jason could swear that one of the figures, sitting in the front row, wasn't even alive. The face seemed to blur in the picture, like a dark shadow that shouldn't have been there. Jason's pulse quickened. He tore his eyes away from the photo and turned back to the counter. The man had just placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, but his eyes were now fixed on Jason. "You ever been to Dry Creek before?" the man asked, his voice quiet but edged with something Jason couldn't quite place. Jason shook his head. First time. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips pressed together. He didn't say anything for a moment, as if carefully weighing his words. "It's a quiet town," he finally said, his tone cold, almost dismissive. "Not much to see." Jason nodded, feeling the weight of the silence in the room. Then he heard it, a whisper, not from the man behind the counter. No, this whisper seemed to come from the corner of the room. He turned quickly, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing, just shadows, stretching in the corners of the diner. The whisper came again, softer this time. He strained to listen, but it was as if the words were deliberately out of reach. Jason's stomach twisted. "You hear that?" The man behind the counter didn't even look up. "I don't hear nothing," he said flatly. Jason didn't press the issue, but a sinking feeling took hold of him. The atmosphere in the diner had changed, thickened, like the air had become too dense to breathe properly. Then he heard it, a low thud, followed by a scrape. He turned sharply, eyes landing on the back of the diner. The door to the kitchen was slightly ajar, and from inside he saw a shadow moving across the floor. Not the shadow of a person, a different kind of shadow. It moved unnaturally, stretching too long across the floor before vanishing into the darkened hallway beyond. Jason's heart dropped. He wasn't imagining it. Something was there. Something was wrong with this place, and with the people who lived here. The door to the kitchen slammed shut. Jason stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The man behind the counter didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Jason grabbed his coffee, sloshing some of it over the rim as he made his way to the door. He couldn't stay here. Something was waiting for him, something he couldn't escape. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he was met with the oppressive silence of the town. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the weight of the townspeople's eyes on him, even though he hadn't seen a single one of them in hours. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt like he was being watched. Just before he could step back into his car, a voice called out to him from behind. "Don't go." Jason froze, the words like ice running through his veins. He turned slowly, heart pounding. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had walked past him at the gas station. She was standing at the edge of the diner parking lot, her eyes fixed on him. "The shadows," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "They're not what you think. You don't want to see them." Jason's breath caught. He wasn't sure what to say, what to ask. But before he could speak, she turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing into the night as if she were never there. He stood there, staring into the void, the wind picking up around him. The shadows were closer than he thought. Jason's hand gripped the door of his car as he stared at the empty diner parking lot, his mind reeling from the woman's words. The shadows aren't what you think. The night had stretched on forever, and the uneasy feeling that clung to him wasn't going anywhere. The silence of Dry Creek was like a physical presence, heavy and smothering. The only sound was the wind, which seemed to be whispering its own secrets. Jason took a slow breath, trying to calm himself. He had to leave. He couldn't stay in this town. But as he started his car and drove down the narrow streets, the strange sense of being watched only intensified. Every turn he took, every dark alley he passed, felt like he was moving deeper into something he couldn't see. Something was off. When Jason reached the small motel where he had rented a room, the eerie quiet followed him. The few lights that flickered from the motel sign were like dim beacons, but they did little to reassure him. He grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk and walked toward the front office, the floor beneath his feet creaking with each step. The man behind the desk barely looked up when Jason entered. "Room's ready. Just sign here." Jason nodded, signed the paper, and handed over a few bills. His mind was elsewhere. He didn't want to be here anymore. He just wanted to sleep and forget about the strange woman, the shadows, and the whispers that refused to leave him alone. The man handed him a key, his eyes flickering briefly toward the door before returning to his paperwork. Jason didn't bother to ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The hotel room was small and bare, with only a single lamp casting a weak light over the bed. As Jason set down his bag, he glanced around. The room was quiet, too quiet, and as he pulled back the curtain to look outside, he saw only darkness stretching for miles. The entire town felt like it had been swallowed by that dark emptiness. He tried to shake it off. He needed sleep, but as he crawled into the bed, he couldn't ignore the chill creeping across his skin. He pulled the blanket tighter around him, but it didn't help. It felt as though the very air in the room had turned to ice. Jason closed his eyes and tried to force sleep, but the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like muffled voices just out of reach. But then they grew louder. Not just one voice, but a chorus of them, all speaking in unison, though their words were impossible to make out. Jason sat up in bed, his heart racing. He reached for the lamp beside him, his fingers trembling. The whispers didn't stop, and then they stopped altogether. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, there was a soft tap at the window. Jason's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He slowly turned toward the window, feeling the weight of the dark outside pressing in on him. He didn't know what to expect, but the flickering shadow at the window was enough to freeze him in place. He stood up, his feet dragging across the cold floor, and crept toward the window, his breath shallow. As he reached for the curtain, he hesitated. What if it was just his imagination? But then, the tap came again, louder this time, more urgent. Jason's hand shot out, pulling the curtain aside, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. A figure stood outside the window, just beyond the reach of the dim streetlight. Its features were indistinct, blurred, like it was caught in the space between the shadows. He couldn't tell if it was a man or something else. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there. Jason's pulse raced, and he slammed the curtain shut, backing away from the window as fast as his legs would carry him. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run out of the room and never look back. But then the whispering started again. This time louder, more insistent. Jason clenched his fists trying to block it out. But the whispers were growing stronger, filling the room until it felt like the very walls were closing in on him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell into a heavy silence again, and Jason's ears rang. He stumbled back toward the bed, sitting down on the edge. His heart was racing. What was going on in this town? What was he supposed to believe anymore? He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to keep his thoughts straight. He knew what he saw. The shadow outside the window. The voices. The people in Dry Creek, they were hiding something, and it wasn't just a simple secret. Jason's gaze landed on the window again. The curtain was still closed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still out there, waiting. The following morning, Jason didn't get much rest. His mind was too clouded with the strange occurrences of the night. Despite his exhaustion, he had to get out. He needed to find answers. He grabbed his jacket and left the room, stepping out into the bright light of the morning. The town was still as empty as it had been the day before. He walked down the street, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Every storefront he passed seemed to have been abandoned long ago. The gas station was closed for business, and the diner had no sign of life. He walked deeper into the town, feeling like he was being pulled toward something. There was an unspoken force in the air, like the town itself was alive, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. As he turned down an alley, he noticed something strange. The shadows in the alley seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching toward him. It was as though the darkness itself was trying to consume him, drawing him into its embrace. Jason's stomach turned. He needed answers. He found himself at the old church on the edge of town. It looked abandoned, its stained glass windows cracked and shattered. The door was slightly ajar, and Jason couldn't resist the pull to investigate. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. The church was empty, save for a few remnants of what it once was. Then he heard it, the whispering. It was coming from the back of the church, from the shadows that seemed to cling to the walls. Jason took a step forward, but the whispers stopped. Silence. Suddenly, he felt something brush against his neck. The air in the church seemed to grow colder, the shadows growing thicker. And in the corner of the room, a shape began to form. A figure standing in the darkness. Jason froze. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time he could make out its face. It was a face he knew, a face that had been in the photo from the diner. But it was no longer smiling. It was staring directly at him. Jason stood frozen at the back of the church, staring at the figure that had stepped out from the shadows. The dim light barely illuminated its face, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same person from the photograph in the diner, the one that had made him uneasy. But this time the smile was gone, replaced with something much darker. The figure took a step forward. Jason's breath hitched. It moved with unnatural slowness, like it was trying to draw out every moment. Jason wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place, but his legs wouldn't move. His gaze was locked on the figure, as if something invisible held him in place. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered. The voice was faint, but it chilled Jason to his core. There was something wrong with it, something not quite human. Jason's heart raced as the figure stepped further into the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The skin on her face was stretched thin, and her lips barely moved as she spoke. "You have no idea what you've come for," she continued, her voice echoing in the cold, empty church. Jason's mind raced. He had to leave. This wasn't right. None of this was. But as he turned toward the exit, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. His heart leapt into his throat. The woman smiled, slowly, as if savoring his fear. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice dripping with cold amusement. Jason spun around, pressing his back against the door. His breath was shallow, and his entire body trembled. The shadows in the church seemed to stretch and twist, like they were alive, crawling toward him, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" Jason finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes gleamed with an unsettling knowledge. "You don't get to ask questions. Not yet, but you will. When the time is right." Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to get out. There was no time to waste. Without thinking, he ripped open the door and bolted into the street, gasping for air. As he ran, the weight of the town seemed to press down on him. Every building, every shadow, every street seemed to close in, like the town itself was alive, watching him. He didn't dare look back, but the whispers followed him. They were faint at first, barely audible, but as he sprinted down the street, the voices grew louder, more desperate. Jason didn't stop until he was back at the motel, his heart still pounding, his legs burning from the effort. The town felt like a labyrinth now, like he couldn't escape it even if he tried. He slammed the motel room door shut and locked it, pressing his back against it as if that could keep the shadows out. The room was too quiet, too still. The air felt thick with something he couldn't name. He paced the small room, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The figure at the church, the whispers, the shadows, nothing made sense. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Jason froze. The sound of it was too quiet, too deliberate. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the door. Another knock. Jason hesitated, then peered through the peephole. Standing on the other side was Sheriff Monroe. He was a tall man, his face weathered and stern, his uniform neat and spotless. He didn't look like someone who was about to play games. Jason hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're not the first person to come here and try to dig into things that don't concern you," the sheriff said flatly, his voice low and gruff. Jason's heart skipped. He had the feeling the sheriff knew exactly what was going on. "What's going on here?" Jason demanded. He had to know. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You've seen it, haven't you? The shadows. The way this place changes people." Jason nodded. "What are they? Why is it happening?" The sheriff looked toward the window, as if unsure whether he should continue. Finally, he spoke. "The shadows aren't just shadows. They're something else. Some say they're the spirits of those who were lost here, trapped in between worlds. Others say they're a curse, one that started long before this town even existed." Jason shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. "A curse?" he asked, his voice trembling. The sheriff nodded gravely. "It's been passed down for generations. Each time someone comes into town and unsettles things, the shadows get stronger. They seek out the ones who don't belong, the ones who aren't from here. And once they get their hold on you, there's no escaping." Jason's chest tightened. "Then what do I do? How do I get out of here?" The sheriff shook his head. "You don't. Not unless you do what they want. They've already marked you. I can't explain why or how, but they've chosen you." Jason's stomach churned. "Chosen me?" The sheriff paused. "The people here know. They've learned to live with the shadows, to hide from them. But not you. Not someone who hasn't been conditioned." Jason stepped back, overwhelmed. "Conditioned?" The sheriff's face softened, just for a moment. "You need to leave, before it's too late. The town will never let you go. But if you leave now, you might still be able to escape it." Jason's mind raced. He couldn't just leave. There was too much at stake. Too many questions still unanswered. But he knew something deeper now. Something that was even worse than the whispers, the shadows, the people. The sheriff was right. The town wanted him, and it would stop at nothing to keep him. Jason stood at the edge of town the next morning, staring down the long, empty road that led out of Dry Creek. The sheriff had given him the advice to leave, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. It wasn't the town itself that held him captive. It was the shadows, the unseen hand that had reached out for him. He couldn't escape it. As he stood there, waiting for his car to start, a movement caught the corner of his eye. It was the shadow of someone or something moving between the trees. Jason turned, but saw nothing. He blinked and the figure was gone, but the shadow remained. "Leave now or you'll never leave," a voice whispered from behind him. Jason spun around, but there was no one there. The town wasn't finished with him yet, and it never would be. Jason had spent the night pacing in his motel room, trying to make sense of everything. The sheriff's warnings echoed in his mind, but so did the voices, the whispers calling his name. He couldn't tell if he was being haunted or if he was losing his grip on reality. His heart raced at the thought of it. Could he leave? Could he escape Dry Creek? As dawn broke the silence of the town, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more oppressive. The darkness crept closer, suffocating him. It wasn't just the town. It was the entire place, the land itself. Jason knew he had to leave, but every time he tried, the shadows would creep just a little closer. He stepped outside, the air thick with tension. He glanced down the road toward the main street, hoping for some kind of sign, but the road ahead was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, he felt the temperature drop. He could see his breath in the air, like a fog of cold creeping up his spine. Jason's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. That's when he saw it, the figure shrouded in shadow, standing at the edge of the street. It was watching him. His pulse quickened. "You can't run anymore." The voice came from nowhere, just a cold whisper that seemed to circle around him, suffocating him. Jason turned, but the figure was gone. He spun back around, his heart leaping into his throat. The shadow was closer now, much closer, and he could see its eyes, dark, endless blackness that seemed to suck the light out of everything it touched. The figure took a step forward, and Jason stumbled backward, terror seizing his chest. He was trapped. No more running. The town had already claimed him. The figure had found him. "I told you it was too late." The figure spoke again, and this time Jason knew it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. He wasn't getting out. The shadow had already locked its gaze on him. It knew his fears, his weaknesses, and it was waiting for him to collapse. Jason didn't know how, but he had to break free. He had to find a way out. His mind raced for an escape, and then it hit him, the church. The one place he had felt the presence of something powerful, something that could keep the shadows at bay. It had to be the key. Without hesitation, Jason ran toward the old church, his feet pounding against the cold, hard ground. He had no plan, no clear idea of how he would survive, but he couldn't stand still. Every step toward the church felt like a step closer to his inevitable doom. Yet somehow he felt the pull. As he approached the church, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. It was as if the world had grown still, waiting for him to make his next move. But when he pushed open the church door, it creaked, and the shadows inside seemed to swallow him whole. The dim light inside flickered and fought against the darkness that surrounded him. The stained glass windows, once colorful, were cracked and broken, casting distorted patterns across the cold floor. The church was decaying, but there was something in its ruin that felt oddly alive. Jason made his way down the aisle, his heart pounding as the shadows seemed to grow stronger with every step. He could feel them moving, slithering in the corners of the room, wrapping around his legs, pulling at him, as if trying to drag him deeper into the darkness. He fought to stay focused. Suddenly, he heard it again, the whisper. It was closer this time, right behind him, so close he could almost feel the cold breath against his skin. "It's too late to save yourself, Jason. You should have listened." Jason turned around, eyes wide in terror. The shadows had coalesced into a figure, a shape barely visible but unmistakable. It was the woman from the church, the one he had seen in the photos, her face twisted with an eerie grin. "You think you can run? You think you can escape us?" She stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a faint, unholy light. Jason's breath hitched as he backed up against the altar. He didn't know what she wanted, but he could sense that this was it, the final confrontation. She was the key to everything. "What do you want from me?" Jason gasped. He was shaking, but he refused to let the fear overtake him. He had no choice now but to fight back. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "What we want is simple," she said, her voice cold and lifeless. "We want what you took from us." Jason didn't understand. He didn't know what he had taken. His mind was racing. "What did I take?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's face contorted, her smile spreading unnaturally wide. "Your life." Jason's chest tightened. "No, couldn't be. You're dead, Jason." Her voice echoed in the church, but this time, it wasn't just her voice. It was as if the entire church had spoken those words. Her voice, the shadows, the very air around him. It all came alive, wrapping itself around him, suffocating him. Jason stumbled backward, his legs buckling beneath him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The shadows were closing in, surrounding him, suffocating him with their weight. But then he saw it. A light, faint and distant, coming from the back of the church. The altar. Something about it felt different. It was the only source of light in the entire room. Without thinking, Jason pushed himself to his feet and ran toward it, the shadows clawing at his legs. He reached the altar, grasping the stone with both hands, and pushed against it. The altar shifted, and for the first time he felt the weight of the shadows lift. The light behind it flared, and the shadows receded. It was as if the altar had acted as a barrier, holding the darkness back. The woman screamed. Her shrill voice reverberated throughout the church as the shadows recoiled. "You can't stop this. You can't stop us." But Jason didn't listen. He pushed harder, and the light from the altar grew stronger, brighter, until the entire room was bathed in a golden glow. The shadows shrieked and retreated, melting away into nothingness. Jason collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The church was silent. The air was clear. The oppressive weight was gone. Jason stood in the aftermath, shaking, his body trembling. He didn't know if he was free, but for the first time in days he could breathe. The town was still there, but the shadows that had haunted him were gone. He walked out of the church, the bright light of day greeting him for the first time in what felt like forever. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. But as he turned to look back at Dry Creek, he realized that he had left behind more than just the shadows. He had left behind a town that had never been truly alive. A place where the past was forever tied to the present, where darkness would always return. And somewhere, out in the distance, Jason knew the shadows were waiting. They were always waiting,